Hello everyone, it's Ren here. Welcome to my room this time, my friends. I hope you're doing well today. Today we're going to talk about why INFJs don't have SI, how it's possible to identify that you're an INFJ through not having SI, although of course not having SI is by no means a sufficient condition for you to be an INFJ, but there'll be many INFJs. There have been in the past, there are in the present. There will be in the future INFJs or people that are flirting with the idea of, seeing themselves as INFJ, but who will be asking themselves, am I really on the NISE axis? Could I be on the NESI axis instead? And often these types that are considered as alternatives that they might be, and that are on the NESI axis are variously, ENFP, INFP, INTP, maybe in some cases ENTP, and ISFJ, of course, right? So you think of these 5 types, right? You'll see, if you're familiar with the notion of quadra, that there are types in there that are delta, INFP and ENFP, and the others are alpha, ENTP, INTP, ISFJ. These are types that an INFJ is likely to wonder at some stage, often toward the beginning, but these concerns might crop up later down the line, whether they might really be those types instead. It would be more unusual for an INFJ to wonder if they really are ISTP, even though that is possible, and technically the 2 types have some, lots in common. ENFJ, partly because of the the intuitive clarity that accrues to the distinction between introversion and extroversion. Now, there's an element of intuitive clarity, but also of objective clarity in how we measure the differences here. Introversion and extroversion are things that are relatively well understood. But anyway, INFJ is likely to ask themselves the question, am I perhaps not an INFJ with one of the types that I just listed? And one way in which you can look at figuring out the the conundrum is, well, just figure out if you're an SI user or not. Because if it turns out you are an SI user, well, then begins your next challenge, your next quest, which will be to identify which kind of SI user you are. Maybe it's one of those 5 types. In fact, it could turn out to be another type, namely there's 3 other SI types that you could be. But if you are able to reject the SI hypothesis, confirm that you're indeed an NI user, but then that might just solve your issue in one fell swoop. And that's very advantageous, and that's why I want to discuss this in this video, because this could be of advantage to you if you're experiencing those doubts at one point or another. Let me just take a second or a short minute to remind you that, speaking of the INFJ personality, this book, right, the Infinite Soul, is just out. It's fresh out of the oven. Oh, smells, so warm and tasty. I don't know what's happening to me right now, but as you can see, I'm really enamored with the way this looks. It's just a very nice product, and if you need it as a companion piece to the Ecstatic Soul, it's even better. Analysis of INFJ consciousness, discussion of INFJ goals and satisfaction and fulfillment and rich lives in the modern world. Get those two books. The link is below to my new book, the first link, but you also have a link to the Ecstatic Soul. So these are works that are really well reviewed, and if you want to understand the INFJ in a deep way, it's really recommended that you get them. Don't forget that I also have a Patreon page that you can join. Had recently 1 or 2 members join, and it's been great to have them, and it gives me hope that my Patreon page is reviving after trying for a long time to get people interested and make them appreciate that. It always really helps me to get that support. In any case, thank you so much to my supporters, new and old. Now, coming back to this question of SI in relation to INFJs, There's obviously plenty of ways that you could try to figure out what the main differences are. And you can easily get lost in the nuances and the richness of descriptions that will try to, convey to you what NI is and convey to you what SI is. But if we're looking for something that relatively is intuitive, that's something that can work 90% of the time and is efficient, doesn't take too long, you ask yourself that question really hard, and once you've answered that question, I wager that you'll be 90% certain that you've got the right answer as to whether you're an INFJ or perhaps one of those SI types that I mentioned. So you want to figure out, okay, are you NI or SI? Now, if you're an INFJ, you're obviously NI dominant. So the presupposed notion here is that you consider, on the basis of your self-analysis and self-descriptions, that introverted perception, PI, as it's often called, let's not distinguish further for now in terms of NI or SI. You consider that introverted perception is an important, very important function in your life. In fact, it's the dominant function in your life. It's the primary lens through which you interact with the world. Okay, so this is an important presupposition, because it means that regardless of what type you in fact are, whether it is NI and SI that dominates in you or is close to dominance, that function, introverted perception, plays a very crucial and distinctive role in your life. It's important to appreciate. So if we take that for granted, then what we really need to figure out is what kind of brand of introverted perception you are, most at home in. What is your dwelling? What is your zone? What it is that you are most naturally like and doing with introverted perception? That's the fundamental question. And one way that I want you to think about it is this. Ask yourself, why is it that we have so many INFJ villains? And heroes too, but there's lots of INFJ villains in literature, in fiction, movies, and so on. Why is it that we rarely have ISFJ villains? Would you be willing to agree with me that we have a lot of INFJ villains, and in the same way that we have a lot of INTJ villains, but we have both. We very rarely have ISFJ villains. Okay. I think the straightforward answer to this is that it's much easier to articulate drama, serious drama, tragedy, massively emotionally intense events, and ups and downs, and just like heavily dramatic sequences in fiction, whatever the format of fiction. It's a lot easier to do with INFJs than with ISFJs. So it doesn't really have to do with whether ISFJs or INFJs are, or say ISFJs in comparison with INFJs. It has nothing to do with whether ISFJs are less intelligent, because there's no evidence, there's no definitive evidence of that. That they are less this, less that, certainly, not less intelligent, not less adaptable to different situations, not less interesting, and so on. These are elements of self-descriptions that are very tempting to make by people who identify as INFJ, because always the berating of other types is obviously an indirect way to enhance your perception of your own type. You berate other types so that by comparison your own type stands out. Okay, there's an emotional motivation for doing this. We all do that to some degree across the day, across the year, often not completely consciously. Let's try to leave that aside as something that's not very serious when we're trying to have a serious discussion. So what is the main difference? Why are there not many, or maybe almost none, ISFJ villains? It's because what's potentially very dramatic and tragic in the life of an INFJ is that their system of introverted perception, whereby they interact with the world in a way that consolidates very a very holistic clockwork of ideas and beliefs, and a holistic worldview of how things are and how they should be. Things hang together. But the price to pay for this coherence and this hanging together and this tendency to always manifest itself in all situations, this consistency of holding on to that holistic worldview, is that it's not flexible. INFJ's PI is not flexible. It's the price to pay for just the holistic glue that allows it to hang together and to be sturdy in every new situation, to be there, support an ethical decision, support other decisions. It's actually pretty rigid at the boundaries. It doesn't easily accept new information and alternative modes of perceiving the world. You see that all the time with INFJs. In fact, you see that also with INTJs, because they're also NI dominants. And that makes for great villains, because it means that you can easily have a very talented, very promising, and potentially ethically good INFJ that, through the accretion of this framework that will not allow other alternative visions to mess with it, won't update and could easily persist in its march onward, even if its march onward were to lead eventually to disaster for itself and other people. So it's this rigidity, this lack of flexibility that is very fiction worthy, but that's also something that you could find out in yourself whether that's true or not. By comparison, SI, it's funny because SI is often likened to conservative attitudes, the status quo, in some sense a certain social rigidity as well. It's like SI can be perceived as socially rigid, particularly if you're not an SI user. But in fact, if you're a strong SI user, you have a worldview, you have a frame. That's PI does that, but it's so much more flexible and malleable. It changes depending on the situation. So if you're a strong SI user, you might be rigid in a particular context, but if you move on to another context, you'll likely embrace, via also the use of NE, which is always combined with SI, you'll embrace the rules and modus operandi of that other framework. And then maybe you'll apply them with some rigidity, but you're flexible. You'll move from one context to the other, just figuring out how things work in one particular context, how things work in another context, in a third context, fourth context, and have this malleability to always adapt. There's no inherent holistic ponderousness that accrues to the inner mind frame of a strong SI user. The exact opposite is true of a strong NI user. And that makes for great fiction, because it makes for really tragic characters. The inevitably, when you have a tragic fate, there's a huge element in fiction. Often it's because there's something in yourself that just will head towards destruction, regardless of what you may superficially try to do. That's tragedy. Well, NI is a tragic function in that sense. A function suitable, very, very suitable to tragic interpretation. Not the case with SI, because of SI's inherent adaptability, flexibility, and its faculty of not being beholden to any particular holistic frame. It doesn't have this ponderousness, this difficulty to be moved around that NI has. So usually, a strong SI user will have a concatenation of beliefs and propositional attitudes that, just like anybody, can't easily be changed, because you want to be a functional human being. You just can't switch from one belief to the opposite across the day. But lends itself to way more malleability and change, and over long periods, sometimes to changing your perspective completely, than an NI user. Strong NI users, even when they try, even if they make a virtue and a sort of what could you call it, an obligation to take in new information from the external world, to change their minds. You can have all the goodwill in the world. It's very good to have that. But the core set of beliefs, the core set of archetypally driven convictions hardly ever budge. Which one are you? Figure this out, and you'll have more of a clue as regards whether you really are an INFJ, or perhaps one of those SI types. Okay, let me know in the comments what you think, guys. Give me a like, give a review to this book if you loved it. 5 stars is always better, and I'll see you tomorrow. Take care, bye-bye.